Scott Smith, and presentation's title is Pianos Without Borders, an experiment in online learning. Please.
Thank you very much for that information, and thank you for including me in today's session. Let me share. I've got a PowerPoint to share with everybody. I was interested to come in just at the end of Professor Urek's presentation where he's talking about technology. This was a very interesting, to me, topic to talk about because everywhere around the world, many functions are leading to technology. So when I first came to a professor at KU, I saw the need for us to have a technology program. That was 15 years ago that I started working on it. So quite some time in the history of piano teaching, a lot of developments in technology since then. So my presentation today is not really about technology. I'm the wrong one to ask what is the right technology to use? What are the latest apps? I'm not the person that knows that. I'm an old man, and I usually ask my students about that. Nonetheless, although I'm not personally knowledgeable about it, I see a strong need for piano teachers to get more involved in teaching with technology. So my speech today is to just give you a little background of this university program I started called Pianos Without Borders, and then tell you about some of the things we've learned in the 10 years that we've run the program. I'm going to be watching my watch, and I'll plan on stopping a little bit early so we can have some discussion too. So let's get started. These are three distinguished American musicians, all of whom grew up in a small town in Kansas. Not Kansas City, our big city, not Wichita, our moderate city, no, just in little, small farming towns. But in those days, in small towns, many times they had a very excellent piano teacher. So all three of these former leaders in American music teaching all came from Kansas. This is a cartoon map of our state. I have a copy of this framed in my studio office at the university, and it makes it look like Kansas is a very busy, lively state. But actually, that's not so much the case. Nowadays, we have a state that's very big in geographic area, but not so many people. And what used to be small family farms supporting families are now big industrial farms. So there's no need for so many workers and so many people to live there. And then that means there's not as many piano teachers. So just to give you all, I'll go quickly over some of the data so you can understand my thinking when I did this. We see that most of the population is moving from rural areas, farms, to urban and suburban areas. What this means, unfortunately, is that our Kansas students are not being educated quite as well as they used to be. These are the tests that American students take just out of the readiness, and you can see on all the subjects, the direction is going the wrong way, going down. In the United States, we also see that ethnic minorities also do not have the same results. So we have some basic problems in our state education program. And since the University of Kansas is a state-supported university, this is something that I feel is worthy of concern. The Kansas State, this is something called Kansas State High School Activities Association, and they offer a piano competition. That's great. So the state sponsors a statewide piano competition. And so I judge sometimes every few years. I'm going to do it again this year because I like to know what's going on in my state. And we find many students coming from rural areas. Some of them have to drive 5 hours to take part in this competition. And many of them, there is no piano teacher in their community. And in fact, there's no piano teacher for 200 kilometers away. So they study with their high school band teacher or with someone at their church. There really isn't any piano teachers in these rural areas. Well, I decided to see if I could take a small step to improve the situation. Since I am a piano and piano pedagogy teacher, I strongly believe that every student should have access to music study, and every student should have a chance to have a strong arts background. So what I did was begged, pleaded, and argued with the Yamaha company, and I got them to not quite donate, but give us a product called a disclavier, and they gave it to us at a very low price. And then I talked to a foundation in Kansas City that gave us some money. Somehow I was able to put all the money together. So a disclavier, as you can see, is just a regular grand piano. And then on the bottom, on the right-hand side, and it's not so clear in this photo that I have, there's a computer box, and that can send signals over the internet. So I can play on my disclavier in my studio, and a disclavier at the other end, the keys will go up and down in real time. So I could live where I live in the middle of the United States and teach a student at the North Pole in real time on a real piano. It's really an amazing technology. You can record on it and it will play back at any speed. But what we use it for mainly is for distance teaching. Now, Yamaha was a pioneer in this technology. This dates back, the early disclaviers, I think, are from the 1980s. But since then, many manufacturers now have a piano that has similar capabilities. The Yamaha disclavier is not the only one. It just happened to be at that time the one that would cooperate with us. We use a kind of a software that's available for purchase as commercial software called one-on-one piano. And it enables each piano to connect directly. And it even works not on disclaviers, on acoustic pianos. And the reason I'm telling you this, one-on-one piano isn't paying me anything for this. It was developed by one of our piano majors at the University of Kansas, and he was in the very first Pianos Without Borders system. And he didn't like the software that came with Yamaha, so he invented his own. So that's how we connect with the students. So I looked around and talked to various public schools, and we started our first Pianos Without Borders program at a middle school in Kansas City, Kansas. A middle school in the United States is for students aged 11 to 13. So right around the age that they're entering puberty. Now, Kansas City is a city that's split in two states. There's Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas. Kansas City, Kansas is in general a more low-income area, and in some cases, not the best area to live in. So here's just an example of where Eisenhower stands. So they have a large minority enrollment. That means not white. Their testing scores in math, reading, and science are not very good. This is because the population, many of them are not native English speakers. Many of the kids come from a home, there is no mom and dad, and they live with some other family member or single parent families. Anyway, it's a difficult situation. However, one bright thing about it is that the school is very supportive of the arts. So this is a picture of their cute little students in the orchestra. They have a band, an orchestra, a choir. They have our cooperating teacher is the orchestra director, and she is a harpist. And so she gets, it's this year it's 5 girls and 1 boy, and they have a harp ensemble, and they take them around and they play concerts in the city, all over the place. This lady should really be getting some kind of special prize. She's a wonderful person and a wonderful teacher. Just to think of how much work that is to carry around all those harps is really something. So, what does this have to do about piano teaching? The nearest piano teacher is 8 miles away. Well, if I want to go somewhere 8 miles, I get in my car and drive. But actually, this isn't a possibility for many of the families in Eisenhower. They maybe both parents work, or there's no one to take the child to a piano lesson. If the child were to take a bus, it's 3 bus transfers. So it's really not a practical thing to take piano lessons if you go to Eisenhower Middle School. So I thought this is a perfect way that we can help. So here's our very first, took a long time to get this together. Here's our very first recital 9 years ago. Our next one is coming up later this month. So those are the teachers and the cute little students that were in our first program. You might think that in a school like that, maybe the students might not be interested in playing piano. Maybe they're just so busy on their basic skills that they don't want to do it. Actually, that's not true. In order to be accepted into the Pianos Without Borders system, they have to write an essay on why they want to take piano lessons. And every year we get about 50 students who apply and would like to take free piano lessons. We can only handle about 10 or 12, unfortunately, so we can't help everyone as much as we would like. So it's been an interesting journey putting all this together. I never really saw myself as a pioneer in technology, because, as I say, I'm not really all that good at it unless someone teaches me. But it's been interesting to learn how teaching online is actually, in some ways, significantly different than teaching in person. So it's my firm belief that all education is going to be done more and more online. I thought you might appreciate knowing what we learned from this program that I think helps us move forward in online teaching. I wanted to take a minute and just discuss with you a little bit about educational philosophy and some of the things that might help you conceptualize in-person piano lessons versus online piano lessons. Piano and dance and the other arts are still following. Are still following a very old model of teaching that's usually called the master-apprentice model of teaching. We see Confucius did it in ancient China, Aristotle in ancient Greece. The master teacher talks, the students listen, and try to do what the master teacher says. So in this, the focus is on the task. In piano teaching, the focus is on the task. What should you do when you're playing, rather than on helping each learner individually. The dominant mode of teaching is imitation and rote learning. I'm an old man, so when I was young, I learned in the same way. My teacher at Juilliard would play it for me and say, play it that way. And that's what I would do. I would try. I'm not making the point that this is bad. I actually learned quite a bit from that. But it's just a different mode of teaching, a more traditional mode of teaching that in fields outside of the arts is not so common anymore. But in piano and dance and other musical instruments, we still use the same model, master apprentice. The composer Rachmaninoff would be the prime example of that. As a teenager, he moved into his teacher's house and lived with the teacher. There were four, if memory serves, four teenage boys who lived there. And the teacher's wife practiced with all the boys and told them what to do. And then when the piece was ready, they would play for the master teacher. So that's the old 19th century model of piano lessons. So we piano teachers have to ask ourselves, is this a model that's still effective in 2024? Does it work as well for our students as it worked for Rachmaninoff? And particularly, does it work well in online teaching? Our experience in Pianos Without Borders is actually, no, it doesn't work as well online. Let me share with you a little bit of the research about why students quit piano lessons. Now, this is not targeted at online lessons or traditional one-on-one lessons that are in person. This is just a study of why students stop piano lessons. This is US students only. In the US, we have a problem with piano study, and that is that many students don't pursue piano study beyond 2 years. Many of them stop. So there's been some research as to why they made that choice not to continue. And here's what they say. They say, first of all, well, I can summarize by saying learning to play the piano is quite a bit harder than they expected. So it's hard work to learn to play the piano, and some of them just don't want to put that time in. Others continue lessons with a negative attitude because their parents make them study or their teacher demands that they study. So research shows that many students don't find piano study relevant to their lives today. They see piano study as old-fashioned, something their grandmother would do, but not something that they want to do. There's a problem with students not practicing enough and not practicing correctly. Many students have the idea that you just repeat over and over again rather than identifying problems and devising successful practice strategies. So students quit because they don't make progress, because they don't know how to practice. So educational psychologists have identified deliberate, mindful practice and a joyful attitude as really important for piano study. And we found that many students don't have that attitude. So my question for you to think about today is, can technology provide a solution to this problem? In our experience with Pianos Without Borders, I would say to a certain extent, yes, technology does solve that problem. So a good friend of mine who was former dean at a big US conservatory now works for a technology company. And he says teachers who use technology will thrive in the next 20 years. Those that don't will fail. But he says right now we have a problem is that many teachers working in technology are not necessarily the best teachers. So our challenge in music teaching is to give teachers the right tools to teach online and be successful and make sure we have our best teachers teaching online and not necessarily just some lesser ones. Here are the ingredients of a successful piano lesson. In this, educational psychologists call this co-regulation. And co-regulation means the teacher and the student take equal responsibility for both areas. So it's not just the teacher's job, like it was in the master apprentice model. It's the student's job to step up and take their own responsibility. So high quality instruction, well, that means a good teacher. You can't improve on piano if you don't have a good teacher. Many performance opportunities. That's important, both in person and online. But even probably the most important is the third bullet item, and that's student self-regulation. The student has to take responsibility for their own process of practicing. We found, and there is quite a bit of research that supports our experience, that teaching online actually makes this better. First of all, we see that the students see online teaching as giving them greater opportunities for student choice and involvement. They like being able to make their own decisions and make their own choices. I've been, as part of our pedagogy program, we have our graduate pedagogy students teaching our Pianos Without Borders students. And of course, this is a good thing for them too, because I can observe their teaching and give them comments to help them improve. So over the last few weeks, I've been observing our KU students teaching the young middle school students. And I always have a laugh over some of the comments that the younger middle school students will say. They'll say, one of them the other day said, well, I think we have to move on now because this piece is getting a little boring. Now, the KU teacher, graduate student teacher who was teaching the boy, said, that's a disrespectful comment. But I said, actually, it's not. It's giving you feedback about what you need to do in the lesson to move on. So yeah, move on to something else and then come back to the piece at the end of the lesson when the student is fresh. So students in the Pianos Without Borders program do speak up and do tell the teacher, yes, I understand this. No, I don't understand this. Yes, I have to practice harder. No, I already practiced that. I see this as a good thing. The students from Eisenhower Middle School are more proactive in the educational process. So both they and their parents have a positive attitude towards learning with technology. Pianos Without Borders is a free system, but the research tells us that parents are willing to pay for online checkup lessons. And this has been a great thing for piano teachers in our area. They might traditionally have an in-person lesson once a week for 30 minutes, and then two 15-minute online checkup lessons. The private lesson might be on Monday, and then the checkup lesson on Wednesday and Friday. That increases teacher income. And it also gives them a chance to check in and see, is the student really practicing things correctly? Another reason that we find digital tools are so effective is that it enables us to reach a population who may not normally take private lessons. Most of our graduate students at the University of Kansas come from big cities. Many of them are international students. We have a big contingent from China, from Southeast Asia, some from South America, and then our American students. And our KU students are city folk. They don't really quite understand that many students don't live in a city. Before I came to University of Kansas, I lived many years in Los Angeles. And if you're a piano student growing up in LA, you have many options, many good teachers. Some important teachers from China and Korea fly back and forth and teach in Los Angeles and then fly back home. There's many, many good teachers, many piano competitions, many opportunities to perform and participate. A piano student in Los Angeles has many, many choices. But a piano student in Western Kansas, which is mainly just big farms and not so many people, doesn't have any of those opportunities. So I tell my KU students, what if the world's most talented piano student lives in a little tiny town in Western Kansas? How could they ever develop their talent if they don't have access to a good teacher, if they don't have access to performance opportunities? It would be impossible. So I see technology as a tool for us to reach populations that are currently underserved, that are not able to take piano lessons because of where they live or who they are. So we've had a lot of success with adult learners, people that want to come back an adult and learn or relearn piano, rural students that live in small areas where there isn't a piano teacher, and then students from lower income families. That would be most of the students at Eisenhower who can't afford to take private piano lessons. And we found that the students are very interested and really want to do it. They just need to have an opportunity. So I see this as an international problem. I teach, I go twice a year, sometimes 3 times, and teach in China. For many years, I lived there for part of the years and taught. And it's a similar story. If you live in a big city, many opportunities. If you live in a rural area, not too many opportunities at all. So I don't know that that's true for every single country, but at least the countries that I've worked in, it's completely true. Here's what our students tell us, what they like about learning and technology. And this is supported by a certain amount of educational research. They like having more input and repertoire. In other words, they like choosing their pieces. They like choosing how fast they go and how much they practice. So for Pianos Without Borders, the student signs an agreement that says, I'll practice 5 days a week. So that's our benchmark of what they have to do. Some of them will become very passionate about it and do more, but we don't let anybody go less. Students perceive the pace of learning as being faster than in-person learning, and they take more ownership. Personally, when I observe these lessons, I don't see that it's faster, but I do see that the students do take ownership and they speak up and they talk about what they're working on and what they want to do. They're willing to be responsible for their own independent work. Interestingly, in our program, we found that they focus on the teacher better. That actually surprised me. I expected that they would focus less because, see, the teacher isn't sitting right next to them. You can't touch their arm. You can't show at the piano what to do. They have to pay a lot of attention to the computer screen. But in their opinion, they do focus more. And actually, I think that's right. Last year, we had one very shy 11-year-old student who kind of was afraid to look at the teacher. She had long hair, so she just kept her hair down the whole time and didn't look. So you might think she wasn't paying attention in the lessons, but actually she was, because she always paid attention and did what she was supposed to. She was just too shy to make eye contact. When I started Pianos Without Borders, I was being a little selfish too, because I wanted to make sure that our KU students had a chance to teach in person so I could observe them. And even 12 or 14 years ago, whenever I first started this, I could see already that online teaching is going to be the future. And I want our KU graduate students to learn how to do this. Now, I think we piano teachers in general have a problem, and I personally have this problem too, and that is we talk too much. We're teachers, so we like to talk, explain, we repeat ourselves. This doesn't work very well online. If you use too many words, the students lose attention. So this is a real good discipline for our KU graduate students to explain things in the fewest number of words. I tell them every lesson should have about 75% playing and 25% talking. And yet many of them flip it the other way and they almost talk the entire whole lesson. I say, no, students don't sign up for piano lessons to listen to the teacher talk. They want to learn how to improve their playing. So our KU graduate piano teachers have to improve their diagnostic skills, meaning they have to quickly identify what's the underlying problem. They have to be able to explain problem solving, the right problem solving technique concisely. So in pedagogy class, I require them to give me, pardon me, simple explanations in 5 words or less. They like to do 15 words. No, 5 words or less. So this has been a very useful training tool for our graduate students. So a teacher who's successful using technology can explain things clearly with a minimum of words. They can provide opportunities for student-teacher interaction. In other words, you've got to leave some time in the lesson for the students to give their feedback. The pacing of lessons is well thought out. And then finally, the big one is they have to be ready to cope with technological challenges. In our experience, the problem we always have I always tell everybody when you start dealing with technology, prepare for frustration. So what we see in online piano lessons is there is occasionally some software problem. More often, it's a network problem. And until the whole world goes 5G, this is just the way it's going to be. Since I'm an old person, this doesn't bother me too much because we're still in the early days of technology, and in early days, things never work well. I remember the very first cell phones, they were like a brick, like this, and you couldn't hold them for very long because your hand would get tired. But now, cell phones are very practical and they're really just a mini computer. So I fully predict over the next 10 years, as the technology improves, that some of these problems are going away, but they won't 100% go away until we solve the network problems. So when you teach online, just prepare for frustration, prepare for challenges, prepare for things that don't work well. That's kind of the way it is. It's very important when teaching online that the student understands what is expected and what's not acceptable. I guess this is true for all teaching, but somehow it seems more important online. So it's the teacher's job to state the requirements clearly and remind often, and do frequent practice checkups. I do quite a bit of online teaching myself, and I do this all the time, even with graduate students. I have a real good student in Germany that's the student of the Hanover University of the Arts. It's traditionally been one of Germany's top piano schools. And I'll sometimes give him a lesson. His lesson is on Saturday, and then ask him to send me a short video on Tuesday. Same reason. It helps me see if he's on track, right? Working on things the right way. And of course, it's human nature. If you know someone is checking on you, you'll do a better job. So these short practice videos have been a very useful teaching tool for me. I use written rubrics for organizing my teaching, so the student knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing every week, and more important, how will it be assessed? So states and many places around the world, these are the items that are very often tested. And so I have a rubric for example, memorization. You have to have the piece memorized 1 month before the exam. We have a little written form and they check it off. And then they have to give 5 performances. Then we check it off. That way, both of us have a written record. I have a lot of students. I might forget how many performances each one gave, but when we have a rubric, that problem goes away. We have a written record. So for those of you that are just starting online teaching, and that may be some of you or none of you, I don't really know, here are kind of the basic equipment that you need to have. In the United States, it's a little bit expensive, but not terrible. As I told you, for this particular program, we use the Yamaha Disclavier technology, and that is very expensive. So a new retail grand piano Disclavier would be over $100,000. We didn't do that. We bought a used one. But you don't need to have that. You can teach from a regular acoustic piano using our software one-on-one piano to another acoustic piano, works fine. You can teach from digital piano to digital piano, which in some ways even works better. So you don't really need a special piano to make distance learning works. That's just we decided to go kind of top of the line. Access to technical support is really important because, as I told you, things are going to go wrong. You can just expect on it. We're lucky with one-on-one piano. Since the developer of that software is my former student, I just call him up and say, Paul, we're having a problem. Please help. And he's always good about helping or getting one of his staff to help. Sometimes for our KU graduate students, well, there's two things. They're sometimes not very patient with technology problems. But the second thing is the teachers have trouble adjusting to the fact that you don't have any physical interaction with the student. You can't sit next to them and demonstrate. You can't touch their hand to show them the right position. All those things that you can do face to face, those physical cues and verb are harder to do. So in technology, no matter how good the technology is, there's always a sound delay. So you can't play along with the student. So again, the absence of physical interaction means your explanations have to be very clear and your demonstrations short and easy to follow. Sound quality may be poor. I've done quite a bit of teaching with all the different types of software. I think they're all okay. I use Zoom. I've used Zoom in the past sometimes. I think the app we're using now is better. But again, it's not always quite as good as you wish it were. Unless you invest a lot of money in having different cameras all around, you can't look at the playing from different angles. All these things are just the practical problems that we run into in our teaching. I wanted to take a minute and just talk about an important, you might call it philosophical and organizational issue about teaching that I think is really an important part of teaching with technology. Plato is another ancient Greek philosopher who said, you can learn things in an hour of play better than in a year of conversation. In other words, playing with someone tells you a lot about how they think and how they learn and what they know. So we have a trend in educational software that's called gamification. And so what they do is they use the structure of video games to deliver education. So the big video game companies spend millions of dollars every year on research. What makes a good computer game? And what can we do to get people to buy our game and play it? So we educators can take the same idea and organize our teaching using these principles of what they call gamification. So here's what computer game developers have learned and what we can adapt to our teaching. First of all, the task always has to be a little bit fun. And the student has to know what the goal is of why they're doing this. I personally wouldn't consider, for example, playing Etudes by Czerny fun, but I might think it's fun if my teacher explains to me, if I work on these, my technique will be better and I can play harder pieces. Well, playing harder pieces, I think that would be fun. So I understand if I work on my Czerny, I'll reach that goal. Tasks should take a finite amount of time and be easy to come back to. I see this as a problem with our KU teachers. They say things like, this piece has to improve. Your fingering has to be better. See, it's too general. The gamification tells us the student has to know exactly what they're doing. You should be able to play the first page with only 2 fingering mistakes. Okay, finite amount, finite, clear task, and you say has to be ready by next lesson. Okay, has to be ready in a week. Colorful imagery is really important in online teaching. So having colorful pages of music that they're looking at, or anything colorful that holds their visual attention, is really important. The last bullet item is perhaps the most important one. In educational theory, just to teach you the fancy name, it's called Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. It's easier than it sounds. Vygotsky was a Soviet educational psychologist. I think maybe died in 1960s, maybe. It's not that long ago, really. So he said you have the current student's current level, and then you have their potential level, the level you want them to reach. And in between is called the zone of proximal development. So in order for students to learn, that's where their learning has to be. If the task is too easy, if it's at their current level, they get bored and they don't practice because they think they already mastered it. If it's too hard, if it's up here, they get disappointed and they quit. So what you do is you just pick something that's a little bit above their current level and just keep moving up step by step until they reach their goal. So this puts a big challenge on the teacher for careful planning. Many of our KU teachers just like to go straight through the method book, one piece, another piece, another piece, another piece. You have to plan what skills you're teaching, how many repetitions are necessary, and the level has to be a little bit above the current student's current ability level. Is technology the answer? I wouldn't say it's the answer. It's a tool that we teachers use to get the results that we want our students to have. Technology has become the norm at lots of important music schools, not just the University of Kansas. But in itself, it doesn't solve the problems. Technology is a tool that helps our students learn. It's not an end in itself. A bad teacher doesn't become a good teacher just because they use technology. You always need teachers, but technology is a way that we can reach more people and meet the needs of our students. And some of the ways of organizing technology really help us in our teaching. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope I gave you some food for thought and some things to think over in your own teaching. I deliberately left some time at the end just so we could discuss and answer any questions. So why don't I see? There we go. See what comments or questions you might have.
Okay. Thank you for this brilliant and fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
I think that we should have too many questions And please, microphone is yours. Questions? Oh, yes, dear Violetta.
Good evening from Poland.
Nice to meet you. It's morning here.
Yes.
So I was right when I started with good evening.
I am a musicologist, but I teach at the Academy of Music, and I know that there are less and less students interested to play some instruments, for example, brass instruments.
Oh, interesting. That definitely is true in the US and
Yes.
in Canada
Okay.
too. I didn't know if it was the same in Poland.
Yes, it is. But we have many students who want to play piano.
Mm,
And we have, of course, good schools, good teachers, and maybe one, Sławomir Dobrzański.
of course. Yeah.
Okay. I worked with him during making some projects.
Yes, he's my good colleague. To let everyone else know, he's my good colleague at our sister school here in Kansas. Yeah.
Okay, fine. And what I wanted to know is about students at or in Kansas University who play piano. Is or are these classes when you teach them be teachers, online teachers, are they obligatory or not?
Well, yes, we make it a requirement. We have two specializations, performance specialization and pedagogy specialization. And performance specialization, they also have to take a year of pedagogy classes.
Mhm.
Pedagogy specialization takes 2 years. But when you're in pedagogy class, you're required to teach in this program.
Okay. Probably it is our future also.
Well, I will be honest, some of our KU grad students complain about it a little bit because piano teaching is very traditional oriented. And they learned in the old model sitting next to the master teacher, and that's what they want to do.
Mhm.
And so they get frustrated with the technology challenges. And you, the students at Eisenhower Middle School are not going to be future piano majors, probably. They are just nice kids that enjoy playing the piano. And many of our KU graduate students have kind of a grand idea of themselves, and they think they should only be teaching very advanced students.
Mhm.
So we run into some problems in that way, but most of them actually do a good job and try their best and are glad they had the experience.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience, from listeners? Any questions? I don't see the hand. Okay, may I ask a question?
Please do.
Okay, so do you think that pandemic helped us to find these new ways to teach piano? So pandemic,
Yes. Well, I think
because it was intensified after pandemic.
yeah. I think if this was happening already to a certain extent, and I wouldn't say the pandemic helped us, it forced us.
Yes,
And
forced us.
yeah, forced us. And so by strange coincidence, I was teaching in China. I was chairman of the piano department at China Conservatory at the time when the pandemic started. But of course, none of us really had any idea how international it would be. And I didn't ever feel in danger. I continued to fly back and forth for a while. So the pandemic forced us to jump onto teaching online, and many of us were not ready. At the University of Kansas, we even had some students who were playing on paper keyboards because we had to buy some digital keyboards for them to check out. But the funny thing was, in music study, we found that the students actually learned okay. Now, in other areas of education in the United States, they have found that during the pandemic, this has caused many students to lag in their achievement. And that's still going on. So a 12th grade student today is behind because of the pandemic. But in music, we did not see that. In fact, we saw the number of students studying and buying pianos, pursuing music actually increased. Maybe because they were stuck at home and they didn't have anything else to do. I don't know.
Thank you.
Interesting, but you're right. That really pushed us.
Yes, it pushed us. And do you think that new generation prefers immersive reality than physical reality for emotion contact? Because I think that the emotional contact and physical dimension is replaced with immersive avatar reality. Maybe this new generation, they need avatars, and it will improve, for example, the quality of piano lessons and amount of pianists or amateurs. So immersive reality, they prepare it. How do you think about this
I
issue?
think about that a lot, and I'm just not sure about the answer. There's a good side and there's a bad side to it. So I think the principles of gamification and organizing your teaching in these small units that just each one gets a little harder, that's a very positive thing. And you don't have to be online to do it. It works for everything that you do. The idea that immersive reality is somehow preferable to daily reality is a little bit more difficult for me to understand, and I see the downside in that. And I agree with you. I see even when I look at students walk around the campus, I see a lot of them are wearing earphones. They're not like I walked around with my friends and I chatted with my friends. I see students more often walking around with earphones. They're paying more attention to media than they do to each other. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? That one I don't know. No one is asking my opinion though either. They just do it. That's their
Okay.
life. Yeah.
Okay. And dear Violetta has a question about woodwinds. And your presentation was about piano. So do you know the position of Stockhausen, what he said about piano?
Tell me.
I just will read it. So piano music has come to an end, and something quite different is coming. I see it clearly. With the devices made up to this time, there is nothing new to discover anymore. So what do you see? What do you think about this? He said it in 1992.
Well, he's not
Does it
entirely
come to an
wrong, is he? Yeah, he's not entirely wrong because piano is a 19th century technology. No, you're right. There isn't really anything new. I mean, the way pianos are built, but an old technology. I think in a way he's right.
Yes, I just remembered his words. And okay, and any questions from audience? So it was amazing, and thank you very much for this opportunity to contact with you and to ask you questions. It was great honor for me. And now I see this session comes to an end, and we have the next speaker, keynote speaker, editor of Rast Musicology Journal, Professor Walter Feldman, with the topic New Music and New Poetry at the Beginning of Ottoman Long 18th Century. Please.
Mute. Now, do you hear me?
Yes, we hear, see and hear.
Well, it's a miracle. I'm all the way in New York at the moment, so it's morning, late morning. So I should begin. Yes, no break, no tea, no coffee. Yes, so I will start in that case. No, I concede. I'm glad that Professor Smith brought up Vygotsky and his zone, because I don't know if I'm ever going to find this zone for this group, since I'm sure you have very different experiences with music. And I'm, so to speak, coming out of outer space, talking about Ottoman Turkish music of centuries ago. I'll do my best. Please forgive me if some of it is not comprehensible. And there'll be some time for questions, I hope, toward the end. No, I call this New Poetry and New Music. Unfortunately, since this is not a course, it's just a little lecture, I won't be able to talk much about poetry. But the original abstract was saying, it's a paradox that Ottoman court music, as a distinct compositional style and repertoire, and the most creative movement in Ottoman poetry, the fresh or Indian style, which is called the Sabke Hindi. They both emerged during the prolonged social and economic crisis of the 17th century. Most of these cultural developments were the work of a group of intellectuals in Istanbul and Edirne. That's to say, it was not being initiated by the Ottoman courts. These were a bunch of ornery intellectuals. In Istanbul and Edirne, usually they were attached to the Mevlevi, Halveti, or Gülshani dervish orders, as well as a smaller group of secular aristocrats and tradesmen, many of whom knew one another personally. To these intellectuals, in the 17th century, it was a given that the center of the Islamic civilization did not lie in their own empire, but rather in the Mughal Empire in India. So I'll try to explain how all these ideas have to do with actual music. Now, as you may understand, as in all Islamic cultures, music was primarily based on instruction from master teachers. Notation played almost no role for centuries. And there was something of a change during the 18th century and then the 19th century. But essentially, the transmission was oral, which meant, of course, that tremendous amounts would be forgotten. And there'd have to be a consistent, coherent effort to transmit more difficult compositional forms and styles. Now, someone had to invest in that. So it was either going to be a royal court, or in the case of Mevlevi dervishes, this very particular Sufi order, which you may know was based on the descendants of the Sufi poet Jalaluddin Rumi, who had moved from eastern Iran to Anatolia, and their descendants continued, to have an order in Anatolia until now. They were great patrons of music, both mystical music and secular art music. So that was a very important form of stability. The other thing to recognize is that Muslim Anatolia musically was a province of Greater Iran. It only began to create its own identity in the course of the 17th century, actually, generation by generation. And the scholars who worked on this, of which first of all my mentor, Owen Wright in London, who first noted in a study he wrote in 1988, that looking at the collections of repertoire, which have no notation, they have poetic texts, names of composers, genres, from the 15th and 16th centuries, he sees that in Anatolia, the music was basically Iranian. The composers were usually Iranian. There was almost no native compositions on that level and composers on that level. And when I wrote my first book in 1996, Music of the Ottoman Court, I couldn't really enter very much into historical issues because there hadn't been enough historical research. Particularly, there wasn't enough research on the history of music in Iran. Basically, Iranian musicology talked either about medieval texts or about 20th century musical practice. What happened between those medieval texts and 20th century medieval practice was completely unknown. Only in the last 20 years, there's a bit of scholarship in Iran, and especially in New York, California, and in London. Owen Wright himself and Pourjawadi, great student now in UCLA, who worked on texts, musical texts from the 17th, 18th century, and we understand more, and historical records of what went on in Iran with music. And then, of course, going back to my first book, 1996, I had two historians then looking over the historical data for me and critiquing it. One of them was Halil Analgic, of course, a great, one of the fathers of Ottoman history. The other was Rifat Abul Hajj, probably not as well known. Rifat Bey just passed away a couple of years ago, but he was then at Princeton just visiting when I was there visiting, and he read my historical sections, and my book basically was based on started with the musical treatise of Prince Demetrius Cantemir. Are we all familiar with this character, Demetrius Cantemir? Raise your hand if you've heard the name Demetrius Cantemir. Not really. Okay, Demetrius, or Dimitrashku, as we call him, was the voivode of Moldova. He spent half his life in Istanbul, and he ended his life in Russia, actually, because he was an ally of Tsar Veliki Pyotr the Great. And so he had to flee from his territory in Moldova. But while he was in Istanbul, he studied with the greatest musicians, and he was himself a great musician and a great composer and performer on the Ottoman lute, the tambur, the long-necked lute. And so after starting my research translating his treatise from Ottoman Turkish, he wrote it in Ottoman Turkish at the request of members of the Ottoman court in the early 18th century. And then I did more and more historical research, and it took me 10 years to finish this book. I gave this historical section to Rifat Abul Hajj, and after he read it, he said, "Tell me, Walter, you imagine that 100, let alone 200 years earlier, that the Ottoman courtiers would have asked a Christian prince from the extreme borders of the Ottoman Empire to explain their own music to them?" And I said, "Well, seems unlikely to me." He says, "Well, yes, but don't you see, something fundamental had been changing in the Ottoman culture at that time, beginning of the 18th century." So he'd been, and I will quote, he'd been, let's say, I ended up many, many years later, we're talking about 20 years later, creating a conference in New York University in Abu Dhabi, where I had been teaching for a while, which was dedicated to Rifat Bey's ideas, and invited several of his students, historians. So the overview of the conference is called A Locally Generated Modernity, the Ottoman Empire in the Long 18th Century. During the long 18th century, the Ottoman Empire demonstrated unexpected strength as well as cultural and political innovations. Turkish and Western scholarship had long attributed this innovativeness to a turn toward the west of Europe during the so-called Tulip era of Sultan Ahmed III. Contrary to this view, in the early 1990s, the Ottoman historian Rifat Abul Hajj employed the term locally generated modernity for a process that began in the 17th century, continued throughout the 18th century, and then partly conflicted with attempts to modernize Ottoman society along Western lines in the first half of the 19th century. Now, by approaching these changes within the context of Islamic and Eastern Orthodox societies as being locally generated and an alternative form of modernity, we can acquire powerful means to understand the potentials latent within these societies. So Rifat Bey had planted these seeds in my brain back in the 90s. And then in 2018, we had this conference in Abu Dhabi, which he was actually, although he was 85 years old, he was able to attend. He flew in from New York. And then a year later, I had a conference in New York, in NYU in New York, which I shared with Harun Küçük, who was a professor of the history of science. He's now at the University of Pennsylvania. He had been part of our conference for Abu Dhabi. And we were contrasting the 17th century with the 18th century. And his work is on the 17th century, showing how the Islamic sciences in the Ottoman Empire collapsed because of the economic crisis, the political crisis, the military crises in the 17th century. So sciences became a do-it-yourself kind of practice, including medicine. So his book is, I believe, called The Science Without Leisure, because people didn't feel they had leisure; they had to hustle. And in the same way, in this period, artistic music was in decline. In the beginning of the 17th century, there was no new theory, very little new composition. And Prince Cantemir, writing 100 years later, says that, well, the theory of music has been totally forgotten, that the practice is hackneyed. And so he had to start, he was asked by his courtiers in Istanbul, at the court, to explain their music to them, because there was nothing relevant. What had been written was talking about a much earlier phase of the music, not about what was being played in his time, in the beginning of this 18th century. So, now the other big part of this question is, as I mentioned, what we call Turkey now was a province of Iran musically for many centuries. I mean, the Persianate musical tradition was enormous, spreading from Iran to Central Asia to India, all the way through Anatolia, and with them, of course, through the Balkan parts of the empire. So any civilized man could speak and read Persian, of course. And I even read that until the early 20th century in Sarajevo, Bosnia, there were clubs dedicated to speaking Persian. At the beginning of the 20th century, still. So, so what happened, basically, what changed all that? One, the Safavid Shiite invasion of Iran in the beginning of the 16th century. And concomitant, around the same period, you had the Timurid dynasty, who had been great patrons of music in Central Asia, were driven out of Central Asia by the Uzbeks, by the Shaibanid dynasty. And in both cases, it resulted in a decline in musical composition. The most extreme was in Iran itself, where the second Safavid Shah simply forbade music, and he executed some of the leading performers and composers. And again, we have to understand that, in case any of you are wondering, that the Islamic world had long traditions of artistic music that they would, in Turkish, called ilmul advar, or ilmul musike, the science of music, or the science of the cycles being rhythmic cycles, Delver, Devir. And the point was that what really distinguished art music were the rhythmic cycles. You could have the same modus, the same maqam, and you could have different levels of music within that same maqam. But the rhythmic cycles had clear divisions between shorter cycles that anybody could remember. Some of them were for dancing, some of them were for songs, for listening. But the long cycles, and they could go up to 88 beats, 60 beats, only somebody who had learned this could understand a piece that was composed. And in terms of the rhythmic cycles, they were way ahead of Western music. Way ahead. And even Prince Cantemir, who, writing in the beginning of the 18th century, he starts discussing the rhythmic cycles and says, again, that Western notation, Western music cannot comprehend these rhythmic cycles. And he says that to learn one of the more complex pieces of Ottoman music, one has to know the rhythmic cycle. And he says the person who does not know the rhythmic cycle will not understand the piece, even if he has heard it 1,000 times. Even if he's heard it 1,000 times. That's his dictum. So this is actually a definition of art music, using the long rhythmic cycles. At the same time, one interesting development within the Ottoman Empire was that when the Ottoman sultans in the early 16th century decided to make the Islamic clergy part of the Ottoman bureaucracy. This hadn't been done in other Muslim states. But the Ottomans decided to bureaucratize the clergy and pay them. And so in a very short time, you had preachers and especially mosque singers, muezzins, who were studying artistic music. And then you have, in Turkey for the first time in the 16th century, you have a new genre, which is called taksim, which means division in Arabic, taksim. Now, taksim is structurally very close to the Islamic chant, tilavet. And basically only somebody who understands Islamic chant could possibly have created this idea of taksim. No other Islamic civilization had this. The word taksim existed, it meant different things in earlier cultures, but this meaning of taksim then spread from Istanbul all through the empire, to Syria, to Egypt, and then all the way up to Wallachia, Moldova, this term taksim, in different meanings, but it had to do with this rubato, free rhythm, largely improvised form of music. So even when the Ottoman sultans, such as Selim and Suleiman in the 16th century, they were not fond of music. They did not patronize music. They patronized poetry, yes, but music, no. But nevertheless, this kind of free rhythm singing and playing was allowed, and mainly the clergy originally was performing this, and then other musicians learned from them. So that was going on. But since artistic music in the Ottoman Empire was basically the provenance of Iranian specialists, and once the Iranians were no longer creating and performing this music, the Turks were in a bind. They didn't know what to do, basically. They could only create Mittelbau music, simpler kinds of music for a more popular taste. The big exception, of course, were these Mevlevi dervishes, but Mevlevi dervishes then were living in Anatolian cities. Right? They were not living so much in the capital yet. And it's very striking. There's about the internationalism of the Iranian style. I came across a publication of a travelogue by a musician from Central Asia called Mutribi Sabarkandi, who visited India in the 1620s, I believe. And he talked to the emperor. The emperor there asked him, could you sing me one of these, he mentioned Saut or Kar, one of the Iranian compositional forms created a generation earlier in Bukhara. And sure enough, he remembered it, and he could sing it. So this is quite striking, because here in the early 17th century, a musician from Central Asia goes to India. The Mughal emperor asks him for a piece created in the Persian language in Bukhara, and this is exactly the repertoire that had been sung in Istanbul, and just documented in Istanbul. And serendipitously, as we say, the poet Jevri, who was a companion of the Sultan Murad IV, who was actually very fond of music in the early 17th century in Istanbul, he wrote a poetic masnavi, a description of the musicians at the court. And I think I published it I published a small part of it in my book, From Rumi to the Whirling Dervishes, which came out 2 years ago. University of Edinburgh Press. And I think Hassan Bey is going to be translating some of this article where I discuss this poem by Jevri. And it's quite striking that in around 1630s, when Jevri is writing, The only genres that he talks about are Persian. Most of the musicians are either Iranians or the students of Iranian musicians, or they're Mevlevi dervishes. Only once he mentions somebody singing in Turkish, and this fellow is an ashuk. He's a folk bard. He's playing the çoğur, the saz, which is a folk instrument. Right. So this is where there was a place for Turkish music, but it was, it was a folk kind of sophisticated folk music. And we have in the same generation the very important two manuscripts written by Ali Ufki Bey. And guess what? Ali Ufki Bey's original name was Bobovsky. He was a Polish speaker from Lvov. Yes. And apparently he was captured by the Tatars, brought to Istanbul, but he made the best of a difficult situation. Since he was a cymbalist, he became a santur player and became part of the court orchestra. Later on in his life, he became an interpreter. And since he had a musical education in Lvov, he knew Western notation. And he wrote the Ottoman courtly repertoire down in the Western notation. Two manuscripts, one in London, the other in Paris. They're both different. In my first book, I make comparisons of some of the same pieces that he wrote in around 1650 and Prince Kantemir wrote in a different notation around 1700. Since then, my colleague Judith Haug, who was then in Istanbul and worked with Martin Jaeger in Münster, did a fantastic dissertation on the manuscripts, especially the London manuscript, the Paris manuscript of Bobovsky. And in my article, I wrote, we had a conference in Istanbul in 2012 or 11, I believe, called Writing the History of Ottoman Music. And then I took the time, I was teaching in Abu Dhabi, so I had a lot of time, and I wrote a very long article which was talking about the musical renaissance in 17th century Ottoman Turkey, and specifically focusing on Bobovsky. And what I showed that in that article is that Bobovsky has several different kinds of genres in his collections. And he has the beginning, I'll put it this way, he does not have the high status Persian repertoire. He does not. And in fact, Jeffrey, who's writing in the same time that Bobovsky was a court musician as Ali Ufki Bey, he doesn't mention him. He was not among the leading musicians at the court. Jeffrey makes a point of telling who was the teacher of each major musician, from whom he learned. Because it was understood in this tradition that if you hadn't learned from a great musician, how great could you be? You had to learn both repertoire and performance style from previous great musicians. Later on, Prince Kantemir, although a Christian and a foreigner, he learned with the greatest, and he mentions who his teachers were, greatest, both Muslim and Christian and Jewish teachers of Ottoman court music. Bobovsky was not on that level, and therefore his repertoire does not show the highest level. He shows a middle brow level in the Turkish language. But he does show the beginning of a development of what he calls the murabba, which was a new compositional form. And some murabba were more folkloric, and other murabbas were showing a more sophisticated structure. And way back in the 1983 or 84 or something, I had a grant to study murabba. I was studying with a vocal teacher in Istanbul. And I also was looking I was in the Topkapi Palace Library, and I found the most important manuscript of again, without notation, but showing poetic text, names of composers, names of genres, of the composer Hafiz Post in the later 17th century. And so I was aware of this issue of the murabba, though we didn't yet have access to notation. As I did my research, I came across the London manuscript of Bobovsky, so I saw something of what he was talking about around 1650. But I did bump into the poetry. This is an important detail. I won't talk much about poetry here, but Hafiz Post's teacher for poetry was a poet named Naili, who was a bureaucrat and a Halveti dervish, and he was the great master of the Indian style of poetry in the Turkish language. And so when I read some of these poems that had been set to music, I was just blown away by the poetry. Ne bişu ne kem alemi yeksan biliriz biz. Her gördüğümüz Nuri Süleyman biliriz biz. So there was no great and small. The whole world is one. And when we look at an ant, we're looking at Solomon. It's the same. So I just was sort of shocked, and then I began to research this poet and his contemporaries, and it took me many years to get to the bottom. And in Turkey, nobody really could help me. Years later, I found my teacher Shamsa Rahman Faruqi from Allahabad, who was a great master of both Urdu and Indo-Persian poetry, who just passed away, unfortunately, a couple of years ago, but he used to be invited to Philadelphia and to New York every year. And he became my mentor in this. And he didn't know Turkish, but I would show him the Turkish poems, explain them to him. Immediately he could say, he's read this poem by Urfi, or this poem by Kalim, or this poem, by Saib, the great poets from India. So we should understand that either the caravans coming from India all the way to Anatolia, in their saddlebags, there must have been manuscripts of the poets that reached Istanbul, because the poets in Istanbul were aware of what was going on in India relatively quickly. Before the internet, it's really quite something, but they were aware and they were responding. So on this level, but again, these were intellectuals. This wasn't at the courts at this point. These were private people who were just interested and were. Jevry himself had poetic seances in his house, where he would invite the poets, and they would find a great new poem coming from India. Let's see if we can write something in Turkish to answer this in Turkish. And that's what they would do. It was called nazire, or imitatio, where they would create something similar but different. And thanks to Prince Kantemir, we also know that in instrumental music, in Peshrev, they had the custom of nazire Peshrevi, that they would learn an instrumental piece, and then someone would compose a piece similar but different. And so when I read this from Prince Kantemir, this was an eye-opener. Nobody else talks about this. That naturally, it's very hard for generations later to know which was the original, which was the imitation response made by another composer, because it was all being transmitted orally. And I'm sure if you had a musician teaching in 1780, he was playing a piece that had been created, in 1650 or 1680, and did he know that this was a response to an earlier piece, or was this somebody else's response? So there's bound to be a lot of confusion about this in an oral transmission. Now, I hope some of this makes sense so far. So we have this decline of the Persian musical tradition in general. It lasted longer in India, by the way, and it lasted longer in Central Asia. But within Iran itself, it was out. In fact, again, some musicians were killed, so it was not encouraging. Now, there were different rulers who did patronize music, and there were sort of a resurgence of composition and performance, but basically the damage was done. And by the end of the 17th century, the music was much simpler. But the interesting thing here, and we know this also from Purjavadi's research into Persian sources, that the Iranians began to develop a different terminology for the singer who sang composed items, complex composed items. He was called a khanende, singer, which in Turkish is pronounced hanende. Whereas the singer who sang religious poetry or other poetry in a free rhythm was called a guyande, meaning one who speaks. And what happened is that in the central area of Iran, gradually in the course of the 18th and 19th century, only the guyandes art survived, not the hanende. And so if you've heard any Iranian music, you know it's called the avaz, the voice. It's based on improvisations around a fixed number of melodic formulas. It's not a taksim. It's not entirely free. You have to learn the formulas and then embellish those formulas. And this, by the way, seems to be a much older tradition than just the 17th and 18th centuries. And one of the reasons I say this is because it has a close parallel in the singing of Baghdad, the maqam of Baghdad. Even when the Persians had not ruled Iraq for hundreds of years, but Iraq had been an integral part of Iran for centuries. And so it's very striking that the Baghdadis have their own conception of music, which is very different from any of the other Arab countries. It is not the same as Iran, but it relates more to Iran, the Maqami Baghdad. And I'm actually grateful that under Saddam Hussein, I actually was invited to Baghdad for a musicological conference. I got there just in time before the wars broke out. So I could hear some of the Maqam Baghdad in Baghdad. So this Guyanda art of the semi-improvised singing, it had a history in Western Iran. It doesn't exist in Eastern Iran or in Bukhara, for example. So in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, they still preserve compositions, sung by the Khananda, some of them using long rhythmic cycles. They're also not the same as the late medieval Iranian forms, certainly not. But they show some effect. Now, who has preserved the late medieval Iranian forms best? The Turks. That actually there is a small repertoire that was known in Istanbul that was transmitted orally. And whether or not we're sure of which composer composed each piece, but they are the musical forms of the 15th century, later 15th century, it would seem. And so that's a reality, and Prince Cantemir was aware of that too. He also takes the trouble to describe the Persian forms, because they were still current, even in 1700. He talks about the students of the Persian musicians, and he also makes the distinction between the Persian performance and the Turkish performance, because he talks about taksim improvisation, and he shows how the Persians do not do that, and that it's only something that the Turkish musicians can do. And he's very interested in taksim. He gives you a model of a taksim which can modulate through the whole maqam system, which he just writes it, he writes it down for pages without notation, just showing you the modulations. So the other, I guess, important point I want to say here is that, as again, the murabba, which was the Turkish form, went through a period of development. It started off, we see in Bobrovsky, relatively simple, but then even the next generation, by Hafiz Post, it seems that it has been developing, using longer rhythmic cycles, becoming more sophisticated. And then that becomes, by Cantemir's time, that becomes the most important vocal genre for the Turks. It's called Murabba Beste, composition for the Murabba. And it can use very long rhythmic cycles. And then by the next generation, this is a very important point, which I just could mention briefly, that after Prince Cantemir was, even in his time or slightly before him, there was already a confluence and communication between the Greek Orthodox composers for the church and the Muslim composers. So his own teacher, Prince Cantemir's teacher, Mustafa Itri, who was a Mevlevi, dervish and secular composer, his composition showed the influence of the Greek church music. At the same time, his contemporary was Petros Bereketis. Note the Turkish name, Bereketis. But he was a Greek composer for the church who also shows a certain awareness of the Ottoman maqam. And by the next generation, Cantemir is the next generation, then the following generation, you have several very important Greek Orthodox composers. And in the talk that I gave at NYU with Harun Küçük, I gave an analysis of one piece by the composer Zakaria Efendi in the middle of the 18th century, who was a composer for the church and a composer for the court. And we begin to see that Turkish music is beginning to use what the Greeks call the theses, the melodic formulas coming from the church music. And I had then a colleague at NYU who was an expert on Byzantine music, and I asked him, "Are you hearing theses from the church music?" He said, "Absolutely, for sure." This was a new thing, beginning in the 18th century, and also it had to do with what we call, my theme was about the leisure of the 18th century. I mean, Harun was talking about the science without leisure, But here in the 18th century, we see a very leisurely style of music, very slow tempos and very long rhythmic cycles, what the Turks call rahat, leisure. Other point I would make here about the sound of music is that Kantemir indicates this, that by his time, there were only two instruments who were the leaders of the instrumentarium of the court music, two instruments. There were the long-necked lute, the tambour, and the reed flute, the ney. Tambour and ney. Now, this was a radical departure from the earlier kinds of Islamic or even the Iranian orchestras. You probably have heard of the oud, was the most important short-necked lute played in Islamic music for many centuries. And we can also research this through the iconography, looking at miniature paintings. In the earlier 17th century, the oud was going strong. That was the most important lute at the court, was the oud. And then by the later 17th century, the oud is replaced by the tambour. And Kantemir was a tambour player. He was not an oud player, and there were no more oud players playing the highest level of music. This was a radical change. Now, another point I'd mention that the tambour is playing with the ney, the reed flute. Now, this is the instrument of the Mevlevi dervishes. There's much poetry, starting with Rumi himself, praising the sound of the ney and the significance of the ney for the human soul. And so the Mevleviya were based all through Anatolia. They only came into Istanbul big time during the 1620s. Then there were several Mevlevi hanes, Mevlevi convents built within Istanbul. And the next generation, bingo, you see a great development of artistic music. No doubt because Mevlevis were there, and a great development of ney. And indeed, in the court, already in the 1630s, when Jevry is writing about the court musicians, indeed there's a great Mevlevi neyzen playing with the orchestra. The thing about the sound to understand is that both the tambour and the ney are very rich in overtones. That the overtone, the notes which are not the basic tone of the melody, but the notes that can be produced, has a life of its own. And it just so happens that for Turco-Mongolian cultures, this overtone is crucial. And in fact, for the research that's been done in Mongolia and Siberia, and even in Kazakhstan, my friend Theodore Levin, who has written a very good book 20 years ago called Where Rivers and Mountains Sing, describing the music of Siberian natives, where it's understood, you've probably heard of throat singing with overtones, right? Now, they do this, they sing, or they play for rivers and mountains, for the spirits of nature. They don't think it's appropriate for the spirits of nature to follow a human melody. The spirits of nature want to hear overtones. They can play melodies for people and also for animals. They will play music for camels, for example. There's a wonderful film called shot in Mongolia called Song of the Weeping Camel, or The Tale of the Weeping Camel, showing how the camel can be made to feel human emotions through the human music. It's an amazing document. So the Turks, remember that it's not as though when the Turks came to Anatolia, they forgot all their music from before, not at all. And in fact, János Sipos in Budapest has done amazing studies where he shows continuity of melodic style from Western Central Asia to Anatolia among the Turks. It's very strong. And my friend Alma Kunanbayeva writes about the kobuz dubası, the voice of the kobuz. Just remember, Turco-Mongols created bowed instruments. We all violinists owe something to the Turks and Mongols because they're the ones who invented the bowing. The ancient Mediterranean didn't know about bowing. Turks and Mongols knew about bowing. And this is where you get the maximum overtones with the bowing. And likewise, the tambours of Central Asian Turks, and again, all Turkic peoples are playing long-neck lutes with a great many overtones. And in fact, I had a student of mine in Tel Aviv University, or Bar-Ilan University in Tel Aviv, compare a taksim recorded by my teacher, Nejdet Yashar, who was the greatest tambour player in Turkey, with a piano transcription of the same piece. This is Asaf Tamuri was the pianist, and he wrote down and he recorded his performance of the taksim on the piano and compared it with the original recording of Nejdet Bey on the tambour, showing how the wild overtones of the tambour create a very different musical space than the piano. No way can the piano create these things. And in fact, neither can the oud, because the oud is a short neck lute, where the duration of sound of one note is much shorter. See, so once the Turks began to think in their own terms musically, they could not tolerate that shortness of sound. It was dead. They needed to have these overtones going into the heavens, right? And even Prince Kantemir, who himself was a Christian, but he was a tambour player, And by the way, his teacher was a Greek, Tambouri Angelos. So basically, everybody who was living in this sonic world mastered these concepts, and this sonic concept, let's say, dominated Ottoman Turkish music for the next 200 years. And it had no parallel. In Persian music has other beautiful instruments, but it's not that. It's not based on that. So that's part of what became, let's say, creative in what we call, it's hard to know what to call it, Turkish art music, Turkish classical music, Ottoman music. Kantemir would just call it the science of music, ilm al-musiki, science of music. And he's, of course, very snobby. So whenever he talks about different genres, and he says, well, he's not going to talk about the things that that aren't part of the science of music. That's not his concern. Somebody else can do that. And it's a very sharp division. And in writing of the previous generations, you didn't have the sharp division because, as I said, there was a middle brow music being played, and the high music was played by people coming from Iran or studied with Iranians. It was not yet a native thing. So this is a big revolution that's taking place from the later 7th century through the 18th century. And it's important to remember that the most creative period for Ottoman Turkish music was the long 18th century. From the time of Itri at the end of the 17th, up until Tamburi Ishaq, beginning of the 19th century, and Ismail Dede Effendi, is really the end of that very creative period. I mean, Ismail Dede himself left the court, went on Hajj, because for a variety of economic and cultural reasons, there was no longer that level of support for high music, for sophisticated music. So it's important to again, going back to Rifat Bey's idea of the locally generated modernity, the Ottoman music had its high point in this period, in this long 18th century. And after that, it was struggling to survive, even in the later 19th century. So, actually, I think I said what I need to say about this, and I can leave the rest of the time for questions, if there are any questions.
Thank you. Thank you for this informative and very deep analysis and very interesting and fascinating presentation. Now, feel free to ask questions, please, from audience, from listeners, please. Dear Violetta, please.
The only Polish here, but history was about Turkish music. I think there will be some specialists, but I would like to ask a historian, because you showed us, as a good historian you are, this book by Bobowski. For whom was it prepared? Was it manuscript? In which language, if there is any language, it was written? and where have you found it?
Okay, those are easy to answer, these questions. I refer you, first of all, to the wonderful work by Judith Haug, who I think is now in Oslo. She left Istanbul, but you can look up Judith Haug, Haug. And Bobovsky wrote these two manuscripts for himself. He was not commissioned. They're not books, they're just collections of notation. They represent what he heard at the court in Western notation. And when it's vocal, he has a lot of languages, he has various notes. And of course, the text of the songs would be in Turkish, not in Persian, in Turkish. But he has some popular music. He has popular music in, I can't remember how many languages, but quite a few different languages. And he has notes to himself in Polish, in Latin, in Italian. He was quite a linguist. And again, I had the theory that since he became an interpreter, he might well have been teaching some of this to foreign diplomats or merchants. Judith Haug says, well, there's no evidence for that, so I don't know. We don't know for sure. But he had many languages. The two manuscripts left Turkey very quickly. Merchants took them away to Europe. They had no effect within Turkey, so we had nobody learning Bobovsky's notations, in Istanbul, no. One of them was taken to London, and it's now in the British Museum. And the other library, I believe, that's the one I used for my first book. I had a facsimile from London, and the other is in Paris. And the Turkish scholars who looked at them superficially thought that, the Paris manuscript is just an early version of the London. But then Jem Behar went to Paris, spent a lot of time, looked at it carefully, said, no. This is a separate book altogether. It's nothing connected with the London manuscript. So we have two, one in London, one in Paris.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, but don't forget that Lvov, he was from Lvov, and Lvov actually had a certain amount of performance of Turkish music in his time, both on a popular level and a higher level. And we also know that the Jewish musicians, the klezmorim, the Yiddish-speaking Jews, who had a guild, as my other field is working on klezmer music, that they were also playing certain kinds of Turkish music.
Okay.
Yes, and remember that the Polish aristocracy had developed a theory of the Sarmatian theory, that the Polish gentry were not really Polish, that they were Iranian.
Jewish, probably, yes?
No, Iranian nomads, Sarmatians.
Okay.
And it's quite a thing, the Sarmatian theory. They try to prove for 200 years that they were of a different origin than their peasantry. The peasantry were Slavs. They were Oriental nomads. In other words, they were sort of Hungarian wannabes, because the Magyars really were Hungarian, an Oriental nomadic group who conquered people from Eastern Europe. There's no evidence that the Poles were that. But it meant that the Polish aristocracy would try to dress like the Krim Tatars and so forth. So there might have been a certain musical correlation, but it hasn't yet been researched.
Interesting place, this Lvov city. I found there a very interesting composer and wrote a book about him.
Really?
Yes.
Let's be in touch about that.
Who emigrated to New York. And his name is Tadeusz Kassan. He died in 1957 and was also consul, politician in some short period.
Wow. Well, why don't you write me some more? I'd like to know more about this. I'm in touch with a couple of folks in Lviv now.
Okay.
Not an easy place to be.
Yeah. Interesting place, yes. Thank you for all details.
Yes, any other questions?
I can ask maybe. Thank you for your informative presentation, Professor Feldman. I am from, I work as a lecturer in ITU, Müzik İzli Devlet Konservatuarı. There are so many topics in your presentations, but you said that Murabba was the first compositional form as we see in Aliufki Mecmua. How do we know that? And do you think it was a popular form and then transformed to the şarkı form?
Well, actually, maybe I didn't explain myself well. I mentioned that Hafiz Post
Hmm.
has he has one form which is dominant, which he never gives a name for.
Yeah.
And so Owen Wright and I were both stumbling on this because first Owen worked we around the same time actually. We were working on the Hafiz Post manuscript, the Mejmua, and we noticed that Kar and Kavul and even Şarkı have a name, but
Yeah.
the most dominant form has no name. It's using Ghazel poetry in the Turkish language, and it can use either medium-sized usuls or long usuls in Hafiz Post. So in my article, which was published in 2017, I have two articles. I have one article about the 2015, which is about the Renaissance, musical Renaissance in the 17th century. I go a little bit into the Murabba in Bobovsky. And I show that in Bobovsky, Murabba can be either a more popular style in a short usul, or it can be a somewhat more sophisticated style in a longer usul. So this is a generation before Hafiz Post. So we see we have this, it must be a development.
Yeah.
Again, the other thing I didn't mention now is the other elephant in the room is that the Ottoman court was supporting the Mehterhane, which was the military music. And the Mehterhane always had to have a sophisticated maqam system and a certain amount of sophisticated usul, rhythmic system. So that continued, and what you see is gradually you have Mehter musicians who become indoor sophisticated musicians. And one of them was Solakzadeh, who was a friend, a Nadim of the Sultan Murad IV. So this is another complexity, that where did they get these long usuls? Since they'd forgotten them from the Persian music that they'd forgotten. Well, the Mehter still had them. So there was a new combination. And again, the Murabba, by the Kantemir's time, it already had a name. He called it Murabba. I don't know why Hafiz Post didn't mention the word Murabba, but then it becomes Murabba, and later on Murabba Beste, composition for the Murabba, and that's always toward the beginning of a concert, not the very beginning, but one of the earlier pieces. There might be one or two in a concert. It was called Fasl. And these are heavy, long, sophisticated compositions. Again, Şarkı comes in, by the way, Naili was the first poet to write poems for Şarkı, which was a more popular urban form in the first half of the 17th century. And Şarkı, of course, is a big subject because it has a very long history for centuries. Yeah, and as you know, it changes its style and so forth, and has many sub-styles. Yeah, so that's the kind of the short answer, I guess, to what you asked.
Yeah. Do you think that Hafiz Post belongs to high class in that period? Maybe because of that he didn't mention Murabba form. Yeah, I mean that Murabba form is a popular like şarkı form.
No. Sorry, no. Murabba is the highest form of composition that the Turks had. It was in the Turkish language, and again, you see it developing in the 17th century in the Bobovsky manuscripts. You see a more popular form of Murabba, and then a more sophisticated form, and the more sophisticated form is the one that survived and developed. And you see the beginnings in Hafiz Post. Hafiz Post quotes his teacher often, who is Koja Osman, who was probably the most important composer. Kantemir also talks about Osman, Koja Osman, and Osman is composing the Persian compositional forms too. He's composing Kaul, and Amal, so he knew from the Persian music. So the only people who still have these old Persianate forms, it's still in Turkish music. It still was preserved orally for centuries up until now. Of course, it began to be written in the early 20th century. Rauf Yaktabe was writing those compositions. But Murabba was the heaviest form of secular music used in the Turkish language. right? So şarkı, türkü, şarkı, these are more popular forms. And then, of course, there were rural traditions, which is something quite different. And it's important to note that again, I refer to János Sipos, my Hungarian colleague, who traveled to many Turkic-speaking republics, including West Kazakhstan, which is a region from which Turks seem to have emigrated westward to Iran and Anatolia, pointing out many similarities in their musical style, what the Russians would call intonatia, tendencies toward intonation, toward rhythm, toward tempo, with Anatolian Turks in those provinces in which the Turks didn't have so much to deal with an earlier population, especially in parts of central Anatolia, where the Turks really came to dominate very early. In other words, they weren't on top of a Kurdish or an Armenian or a Georgian population. There was, or a Greek population further west. So you see real Turkic musical features among the folk music of those Turkic groups in Anatolia. And again, I was very surprised. I remember I helped Professor Sipos with the English of his book, and I was skeptical initially. Do you mean that there was really a transmission that was continuing for almost 1,000 years? Because people didn't come anymore from that part of Central Asia to Turkey. And then when I looked at his musical examples, and I myself made a field trip with my friend Alma Kunanbayeva from Petersburg, and she is a great Kazakh ethnomusicologist, and we went through the Western steppes. I did recordings with her. And indeed, many of the things that her professional, not the folk music, mind you, but the professional music, what the Russians call professional music of the oral tradition, the zhrao, the zhr singers and players of their dombra, very much resemble the intonatia of a baglama player in Anatolia. And again, these guys had not been in contact for many, many centuries. So it shows you that among the Anatolian Turks, there was a sense of a musical identity that was being transmitted generation after generation. It's quite remarkable in that sense. But it seems to be a fact. Again, I was skeptical, but then when I traveled and I heard the music, and I said, yeah, I can't see any other explanation for this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you
İnşallah
very
bir gün
much.
görüşürüz.
Görüşürüz.
İnşallah İstanbul'da.
İnşallah hocam.
Thank
Any other
you.
questions?
Any questions? I don't have question. I just have a little comment. In Georgia, we also have muraba, and it means only jam of fruit jam.
But yes, of course.
Yes, fruit jam. And I thought that it was Georgian word. Sorry. So, and it is interesting because Persian and Turkish poetry influenced Georgian poetry in music, traditional music, and it will be very interesting to investigate also in Georgia. Is there any influence, a little influence of muraba in Georgia? So thanks for this issue. So thanks, I'm very interested because Persian poetry influenced Georgian poetry very much from the very beginning, and it's very interesting. Thanks for this issue. Thanks.
There's more to be said about this too, by the way, because in New York I studied with Antranik Arustamian, the great Armenian kamancha player who also worked in Azerbaijan and so forth. And I understood that his teacher was a Georgian, Sasha Ogonashvili.
Yes.
And that in the previous generation, the mugham of Azerbaijan was the music of all urban people, whether they spoke Georgian, or they spoke Tati, or they spoke Armenian. He was an Armenian. But his classical music was the mugham of Azerbaijan. He wouldn't call it Azerbaijan. He would say the mugham of the Kafkas.
Yes.
Again, he learned it from a Georgian.
Yes. In Tbilisi, we have mugham.
Mugham, yeah. And in fact, I have, in Budapest, I have a book which was given somehow, published in Baku, on the great musicians of Azerbaijan in the Azeri-Turkish language. And there's a long chapter on Sasha Ogonashvili. He was an important musician, recognized both by Georgians and by Azeri Turks. So it's interesting. And then his last, we have him in the end in New York with Antranik Arustamian, emigrated from Baku to New York. Anyway, so it's a long story, isn't it? Yes, interesting.
Thank you. And very little short question. In your title, you have in quotes, long 18th century. I understand that it's metaphorically, but what do you mean? Long 18th
This is
century.
Rifat Abul Hajj's terminology. He created this in the 1990s because what he's trying to say, he means the last generation of the 17th century until the first generation of the 19th century. That's what he means by his phrase, long 18th century. And he was not a musician, he was a historian, but he tries to show that certain political cultural patterns that you see then continued up until the earlier 19th century. Now, as a musicologist, I feel that it's more appropriate for music than for anything else. He didn't know that.
Yes.
He created it. But in fact, for music, that's exactly the period that we're talking about. And since we have some notations, we can show that before that generation, it did not yet exist. It starts, again, in Turkish music history, something actually happens. It's not, again, the Turks often would think that, our music never changes. It's been the same for hundreds, thousands of years. Western music changes, but we don't change. But in fact, there was a radical change at that time, in this period of what he calls the long 18th century. And it continued to change in every generation, which was one of the problems in transmission, because that's what Kantemer even is saying, that he says, by the way, in his theory, book of theory, that what one musician says does not agree with what another musician says. Because the music was changing so rapidly that certain teachers had a certain way of explaining things and learned a certain repertoire. And then the next person, even within Istanbul, had a different line of transmission. And so Kantemer himself says this. And so it became even more so, as things went on. Things were changing rapidly. And by the way, I have an article. We had a conference in Münster 10 years ago, 2014, about rhythmic cycles, where I talk about these changes in the rhythmic cycles over time. Owen Wright had first noticed this in the late 1980s, comparing different notations in different periods. But in Turkish music, the tempos and rhythmic cycles changed dramatically in the course of the long 18th century. Again, nobody in the world has rhythmic cycles as complex as Ottoman Turkish music. It's a really unknown treasure.
Yes. Thank you very much.
I have another question. Professor, in your abstract, you talk about tradesmen, musicians, and a little bit, but I'm nowadays I'm interested in the tradesmen, musicians and composers in that period. Do you think did they have a big role in transmission of makam music in that society, in that period?
Well, they must have, because we have a few examples, both Christian, Jewish, and Muslim.
Yeah.
Zakaria Efendi, Kürkçü.
Yeah.
Furger.
Burcuoğlu.
Yeah, and Buğurcuoğlu, the spice dealer.
Yeah.
Right, but they were also. But remember, the tradesmen were often, when they were Muslims, they were interacting with dervish groups. So, in fact, the let's say the big institution which was transmitting art music to the middle classes in the cities were the dervish orders. Both the Halvetiya, Kadiriya, Mevleviya, and I've even seen this in my own time. In the 80s, 70s, 80s, working with Halveti dervishes, you had transmission of artistic music from some of these people to people with less education. That was sort of one of their social functions.
Yeah,
was to educate. This is very much our theme in this conference. Yes, they were educating people with less intense musical education. They saw that as part of their mission. And certainly Mevlevi dervishes from the get-go, they would accept a talented student of any background, any religious background.
Yeah.
It's very important. So yeah, it's an important theme. I wish we had more biographical information. Usually we have very, very little.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you. If there are not any questions, we have to summarize our session. Thank you very much. And